Chapter 5 Immigration, the Organization of Fallen Man. As for the assembly, there shall be for both you and the resident alien a single statute, a perpetual statute throughout your generations. You and the alien shall be alike before the Lord. You and the alien who resides with you shall have the same law and the same ordinance. Numbers 15, verses 15 to 16. God has a sense of humor. When I laid out my plan to preach this series, long before it became a book, I did not think that when the moment came to preach this particular message, I would have to do it during a time when the world was watching thousands of Central American immigrants head towards America. In fact, when I first heard about the caravan, I chuckled because I knew I was going to be covering the topic. Funny how God works. Before we dig into the history of immigration here in America and look at what the Bible actually says about the issue, I need to make sure we clear the air, as it were, with anything a detractor might drum up against me. It's not an overstatement to declare that the church at large has refused to teach on the topic. A quick search on sermon audio will pull a few messages, but many of the results were radio shows, not sermons. When I typed in justification by faith, over 1,000 sermons showed up. Clearly the church is not actually teaching the whole counsel of God like she thinks she is. Part of the reason for this is because the modern Christian does not believe that political theory is anything to fuss about. Due to the errors of premillennial advocates and the radical two-system troop, Christians are barred from dealing with these issues because they aren't spiritual topics. And we are supposed to just preach the gospel. This, of course, is a radical Gnosticism that must be rejected because the Bible does speak to the whole of life, and we must be able to do the hard work of learning and implementing what it teaches. So, by way of simple preface, we reject altogether the notion that these topics are off limits, because the Christian faith is a comprehensive faith, one that touches on every facet of life, especially politics. Besides, immigration has only become a political issue because we have let it become that. The free movement of free individuals is meant to be free. When the state touches it, are we really surprised when it becomes a political issue? This is all because we hate liberty and prefer statism, as we'll see in a bit. Before we dig into the passage, I want to walk you through a quick history of immigration in the United States so you can see how far we've strayed. All of this information is widely available, and you can find it fairly easily. Keep in mind that the United States Constitution, in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 4, says that the Congress has the power to, quote, establish a uniform rule of naturalization, end quote. Don't miss this. Congress is granted the power to determine the process of how one becomes a citizen of America. This has nothing to do with the free individuals visiting, working, or crossing the border into the country, nor does it give the executive branch power to do all as it pleases. And now, a brief history. On March 26, 1790, the Naturalization Act was passed. In short, this law limited the naturalization process, the process of citizenship, to free white persons who had good character. In order to know who had good character, they had to live 2 years in the U.S. and 1 year in the state of residence, all before applying. This law excluded American Indians, black slaves, and free blacks. Some states did allow for free blacks to have citizenship. Also contained therein was the citizenship given to children born to U.S. citizens who were abroad at the time of birth. This act was repealed in 1795, and the one enacted in 1795 was repealed 3 years later in 1798, and even that one only lasted 4 years before being repealed in 1802. These repeals were focused on the time frame required before someone could become a citizen. The one in 1798 extended it to 14 years. In 1819 was the first significant federal legislation on immigration. The Steerage Act of 1819 established both the reporting of immigration to the U.S. as well as outlined rules for ports and ships and passengers on board. On July 4th, 1864, President Abraham Lincoln signed an act to encourage immigration, which was the first act of its kind. This was also Congress's first policy, granting them centralized control over immigration. If there was ever a door which awakened the machine of central planning, this was it. The Senate gave the President the power to appoint a commissioner of immigration, who was subject to the Department of State. This person could hold office for 4 years, and the act stated that his salary would be $2,500 per year. This was a major step forwards in giving the United States government power that the Constitution simply did not give it. As a side note, the act also gave permission to have in New York City the United States Emigrant Office. In 1875, there was direct federal regulation of immigration, which prohibited the entry of prostitutes and convicts. Another major leap forward with regards to the government's control of immigration was the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was signed into law by President Chester Arthur on May 6, 1882. This prohibited all immigration of Chinese laborers. It was without a doubt a racist attempt at nationalism, which we will touch on later. In 1891, the Bureau of Immigration was established as the central planning group over the issue. The Immigration Act of 1903 soon followed, and it was the next law regulating immigration, this one banning anarchists, people with epilepsy, beggars, and importers of prostitutes. The Naturalization Act of 1906 was passed in Congress and signed into law by Theodore Roosevelt, and it required immigrants to learn the English language in order to become American citizens. It was repealed and replaced in 1940 and modified in 1990. A few more to consider. In 1719, we had laws and restrictions about people with medical and moral conditions, illiterates, imbeciles, and alcoholics. And this also put a head tax of $8 per person on immigrants. The 1920s gave us a quota system whereby it was regulated how many of certain people groups could enter and how many could be in a particular county. In 1948, we have the first U.S. policy for admitting people fleeing persecution. It limited 205,000 refugees over 2 years. It was later increased to 415,000. 2 years later, in 1950, communists were excluded and subversives were deported. In 1952, gave witness to the Immigration and Nationality Act, which was a sweeping change of statute and brought everything into one comprehensive law. It reaffirmed the quota system based on nationality and origin, limited Eastern Hemisphere migrants, established a preference for skilled workers and relatives of U.S. citizens, and issued tighter security standards. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, promoted by Ted Kennedy and signed into law by Lyndon Johnson on October 3rd, abolished the quota system, but still restricted the number of immigrants allowed into the country and thus restricted the naturalization process. Still restricting sexual deviants, like homosexuals, the law opened up the door for more allowance of Asians and Africans. In the 1970s and 80s, there was a change in refugee standards, and the next big law arrived in 1986 with the Immigration Reform and Control Act, signed by Ronald Reagan. This law required employers to declare the immigration status of their employees, made it illegal to knowingly hire immigrants, legalized seasonal agricultural workers, and legalized undocumented immigrants who entered the U.S. before January 1st, 1982. This amnesty required the immigrant to prove he had knowledge about the U.S. history and government. He also had to prove he had the capability to speak English. Imagine having to prove your historical knowledge to a government bureaucrat. On September 30th, 1996, Bill Clinton signed into law the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. Though dealing in large part with the deportation standards, the law also gave authorities to the Attorney General to construct barriers along the U.S.-Mexico border. Since then, we've had several laws regarding amnesty and immigration from certain parts of the world. You may recall, thanks to Republican President George W. Bush, the Homeland Security Act of 2002, which created out of thin air the Department of Homeland Security, who took over control of all immigration enforcement. There has been various visa reforms acts in recent history, and who could forget the Real ID Act of 2005, which dealt with identification of individuals. Your papers, please. Another big one was the Secure Fence Act of 2006, signed into law by President Bush. It authorized additional fencing along the southern border and authorized vehicle barriers, more checkpoints, and lighting to prevent people from, quote, entering our country illegally, end quote. So that's the history of the American law on immigration. In a decently sized nutshell, you should have noticed that over time, central planning took over and the US government was given more and more control. Not only is this entirely unconstitutional, it is completely immoral. In fact, many of these laws stem from socialist and racist ideologies. The nationalistic fervor of our country has grown tremendously, and judging by the reaction of modern conservatives today, who are simply yesterday's liberals, the vehemence and vitriol over the situation of the caravan is a damning indictment on just how far we have fallen away from biblical law. And to the Bible we must go. It goes without saying, since we are Christians after all, that we believe the entirety of the Bible. I'm going to discuss a lot of different things, mostly from the Old Testament, but that does not mean it is irrelevant or wrong. I also understand that we are not a nation that cares about the covenant of God, and thus we are not a nation that cares about biblical law. But just because we have forsaken Christ the King does not mean that we embrace status law. You do not get out of sin by walking away from the solution. Just because the nation right now rejects biblical law does not mean we abandon it and try to go in another direction. So, to the teaching and the testimony we must go. In Numbers 15, verses 15 and 16, God laid out some basic concepts regarding biblical law and immigration. Quote, "As for the assembly, there shall be for both you and the resident alien a single statute, a perpetual statute through all your generations. You and the alien shall be alike before the Lord. You and the alien who resides with you shall have the same law and the same ordinance." End quote. It is assumed that aliens, foreigners, and strangers will be among Israel inside her borders, and they are to be treated a certain way. The way that they were to be treated was built on love. And since love is the fulfillment of the law, Romans 13, verse 10, true love is thus a lawful love. There was to be one statute, the law of God, for covenant Israel and the alien who sojourns among them. It was to be a perpetual statute throughout the generations. And at the end of verse 15 it says, "You and the alien shall be alike before the Lord." Take extra notice of this up front. There is one law for Israel and for the alien. According to God's law, God's holy standard, the only way of differentiating between people is the covenant, not race, not nationality, not country or flag. There was never a point in time where Israel was defined exclusively by bloodline. Because God is the creator of all people, it follows that all people are accountable to His holy law word, which means there is only one legitimate law, and all people are defined in terms of this covenant. The law of God determines who is a covenant member, not race or blood. You could have someone like Ruth the Moabite be a member of the covenant, and have someone like Esau, the son of Isaac, not be a member of the covenant. Hebrews 12, verse 16. Citizenship in Israel was always on a moral basis. It was never racial or nationalistic. It was covenantal. Non-biblical law will inevitably place race, ethnicity, and nationality above morality and biblical faith. God's law is ethical. Man's law is unethical. The historical motivators that put immigration laws into place was because of socialistic, racist views of man. This collective superiority is the cancer that is destroying the West, and modern conservatives are the ones embracing the nonsense. All of this stems from two very important points, and these are points that will never be talked about on Fox News or CNN. They will be the first two things to go out of the window whenever talking to Republican or Democrat. Here's the first one: the principle of ownership. From cover to maps, the Bible is clear. God is the creator, and he holds the deed to the earth. The earth is the Lord's, and everything contained therein, and this includes people. Leviticus 25, verse 23 reads, quote, "The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. With me you are but aliens and tenants." End quote. Here, God makes it clear that the land belongs to him, and any human who walks on it is a sojourner. God owns it. We are called to be covenantal stewards. The land is God's. His covenant people are aliens. And this is not just about Israel then, it's about America now. Not only have we forgotten that our ancestors were immigrants, we have forgotten that we are as well. Biblical law should be our controlling principle, not political propaganda. Far too many Christians have attached themselves to the teat of the Republican Party, and because of it, they cannot see this issue clearly. They throw this principle of God's ownership out of the window and begin to argue in collectivist, socialist terms. "They're taking our jobs," or "This is our country." Forget the fact that these are image bearers fleeing from the oppression our nation created. All that matters then is our nation. Ownership thus becomes this elusive, inchoate collective, and instead of biblical law, we give ourselves to socialism and racial prejudice. When we reject this principle of ownership and the priority of God, we create an immigration issue completely out of thin air. Borders in the Bible limit governments, not individuals. Individuals can work, visit, and vacation freely. Governments may not. The Bible never gives the civil magistrate the authority to control where and when people go to this place or that. Their job is to uphold God's law and punish evildoers. Non-criminal individuals are free, under the authority of God's law, to travel and work as they please. There is also a locked front door fallacy that needs to be addressed because I hear this one a lot. The property that you own or rent because of compulsory taxation is yours by God's delegation. It is given to the individual and family. So yes, you can lock your door and shoot anyone who breaks in at night. The land that America occupies is not owned by the collective, so no, you may not lock it. Again, who's the owner? This is the question no one wants to talk about. The land is not the front yard of the government. It is God's land. And while we are here, those who own land at the border end up having it confiscated by border agents because there is an urgent need for a wall. Naboth's vineyard, anyone? Ownership is the first principle that is rejected. The second is citizenship, or covenant. We are undoubtedly a nation that had significant Christian influence early on. However, we abandoned that fairly quickly when slave ships were permitted to dock in our ports. And we are now reaping what we have sown. Instead of covenanting with God and abiding by his law, we have developed a nation that rejects God's covenant and has instead embraced nationalism and statism. Remember, citizenship in Israel was always on a moral basis. It was never racial or nationalistic. It was covenantal. Humanist law will inevitably place race, ethnicity, and nationality above morality and biblical faith. The problem that conservatives refuse to acknowledge, and it makes sense why they refuse, is this issue of citizenship. Citizenship must be covenantal in terms of God, not the state. In ancient Israel, we had a couple of things going on. First, you had the sojourner, who was a naturalized citizen, someone living in the land who was in covenant with God, someone who could partake the Passover meal. They were circumcised. They adopted the faith of Israel. Second, you had the foreigner, who was someone living in the land who was not in covenant with God. They too were to abide by God's law, and any attempt at subversion would be squashed, because again, there is one law for everyone. I submit to you that the immigrant issue simply cannot be resolved without understanding covenant. Though the Constitution gives permission for the government to regulate the process of naturalization, the reality is it was only a matter of time before this spun out of control. It was only a matter of time before more government regulation came. This is because citizenship is supposed to be covenantal, not nationalistic. The term illegal immigrant, for example, is a fictional fiat term derived from unbiblical categories. The only grounds for differentiation between individuals was God and his law, not race, not ethnicity, not nationality, and certainly not man's law. Thus, citizenship is ethical, not national. It was always a matter of obedience to God. Which is why we need to have an ethical or judicial, that is, covenantal understanding of immigration. Instead of the talking points of liberals and conservatives, the church needs to be mature enough to discuss the issues on these terms. God's law forbade Israel from mistreating the alien or foreigner. See Exodus 22, verse 21, 23:9, Leviticus 19, verse 33, Deuteronomy 1:16, 10, verse 18, 23, verse 7, 24, verse 14, and Malachi 3:5. God's law was intended to protect the alien, but it was also intended to protect the covenant land. Covenant land in Israel could not be alienated because the law of God was and is fixed. Covenant curses, Deuteronomy 28:15-68, would confound Israel, and the land would vomit them out, just like the Canaanites were vomited out. Covenant is never solely about ritual and activity. It is also about location. God's purpose in man taking dominion over the earth is tied to the actual earth. We think we can divorce ourselves from God in all matters of life. We like to detach God's ownership of the earth and declare ourselves to be the owners. And we are surprised that God is removing the control of the land from his dominion agents. We are surprised that the church has, by and large, been lost in the shuffle. Could it be we have hated our neighbor? The job of covenant man is to take care of the stranger. Could the problems we face today be because we have forsaken this responsibility? Perhaps it's because we have poorly treated and berated our neighbor instead of befriending and loving her. The church's primary combatant right now is not the world, but the Holy Spirit. We have neglected justice and failed to take care of the stranger, and because of it, the Holy Spirit of God has brought sanctions against us using the very law of God we are commanded to obey. If we are going to disciple nations, you better believe that we are going to have to deal with political theory. If we are going to disciple nations in the manner God says we should, then our political theory ought to be based upon that which God has said in his law word. We have to stop making the same mistakes and repeating the same sins that Israel had done over and over again. God told Israel to remember that such were some of you, and God also told them, you are not your own. This is covenant, and this is ownership. Such were some of you. You were an alien and a stranger at one point, and you are not your own. You were bought by Christ, and your job is to serve him, not the state. Covenant people are people who serve others, not send the National Guard to open fire the minute someone crosses the border. Covenant people are people who treat others the way you want to be treated. Pagan slave societies were absolutely brutal. Remember Israel in Egypt? There is a reason many left to come to Israel because the law of God in Israel was wisdom in the sight of the nations. Deuteronomy 4. We are called to welcome the stranger and serve the widow and orphan, not come up with 1,000 excuses why we should not. This is the basic ethic of the covenant. And until the church here in America recovers this ethic, we are going to see ourselves in a lot of trouble, more so than what we already have going on. The church has embraced the politics of humanism without a doubt. Many evangelicals are functional Marxists. Marx was not in favor of open borders and immigration because it never helped his materialistic agenda. When new entrepreneurial people come into a country, they benefit the economy and create new jobs. Thus, the central government loses jobs and control. The church has, by and large, been okay with cradle-to-grave security. And the reason conservative Christians want closed borders is because they want more government control. Why? They don't trust God. They have been fine with a growing deficient state. Why wouldn't they want to protect that? And for whatever reason, conservatives still don't understand that in history, it was the socialists and the communists who built walls. Remember Berlin? People say, you don't believe in the letter of the law of the land? No, not when it lacks Holy Spirit infusion. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. Where the Spirit of the Lord is not present, there is slavery. Friends, we have a lot of repenting to do. The gospel of Jesus Christ demands that we love our neighbor and treat the stranger in a manner consistent with how Christ treated us. And if we cannot get this basic requirement of the gospel right, God will visit us with judgment, and you will not be able to say it was unjust.